Imagine building a place of peace with your own two hands. A log cabin deep in the woods, a quiet escape where generations of memories are carved into every beam. Now imagine waking up one morning to find bulldozers rolling across your property. Not for a highway project, not for a government seizure, but for something far pettier. An HOA claimed you owed them a few $1,000s in unpaid fees, fees you never even agreed to pay. And while you scrambled to prove your rights, they tore it all down. But this time they picked the wrong family, because when you come for a man's home, you come for his blood. And this man's bloodline? Federal agents. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. Rough-cut logs, patched shingles, and a porch that leaned just a little too far to the left. But to its owner, Daniel, it was perfection. His father had bought the land decades earlier, back when no HOA dared to set rules on the far edge of the county. The cabin wasn't just wood and nails, it was a sanctuary. Summers were filled with fishing trips, winters with fires crackling in the hearth. And every year, a fresh carving was added to the doorframe. A family tradition marking births, marriages, and milestones. For nearly 20 years, no one bothered Daniel or his land. He paid the county taxes. He kept the property clean. He followed every local law. The HOA, as far as he was concerned, had nothing to do with him. Their boundaries stopped nearly a mile away from his land, where newly built subdivisions began, crowding into the once empty fields. But HOAs are like creeping vines. Once they wrap around a neighborhood, they don't stop at fences or old survey markers. They grow. And when developers eyed Daniel's patch of woods for expansion, the HOA saw dollar signs. To them, the little log cabin wasn't a piece of history. It was an obstacle. It started subtly. Daniel received letters he never asked for. Newsletters about community pool hours, reminders about landscaping rules, invitations to board meetings. He laughed at first, tossing them into the wood stove. His cabin didn't even have the same street address system as the subdivision. How could he possibly be under their thumb? But the letters turned into invoices, small at first, then larger. HOA annual dues, $800. A year later, past due balance $1,600 plus late fees. The numbers snowballed, each envelope stamped with harsher words. Final notice, delinquent account, immediate action required. Daniel ignored them, convinced it was a mistake that would blow over. The cabin had always been outside their reach. What could they possibly do? But he underestimated just how far an HOA will go when it smells blood in the water. Behind closed doors, board members were already discussing enforcement options. They didn't see Daniel as a man. They saw him as a problem to be solved, and a warning to anyone else who thought they could defy the rules. One spring morning, as Daniel repaired the porch railing, he noticed strange survey stakes in the ground near his driveway, neon pink ribbons flapping in the breeze. By the time he walked back to the cabin, a white SUV with the HOA logo had pulled up at the edge of his property. A man in sunglasses stepped out, clipboard in hand, scanning the trees like he already owned them. Daniel's gut twisted. Something was coming. What he didn't know then was just how far they'd already gone. Because while he sanded wood and patched shingles, the HOA had already filed paperwork in county court. Paperwork declaring his home within jurisdiction and his account delinquent. To them, he was just another line item, unpaid fees, $3,140, enforced by lien. But their ambition didn't stop at a lien. They wanted the land. They wanted the cabin gone. And they were about to make their move. The morning the machines came, the sigh. Forest was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel woke to the distant hum of engines, low and steady like a swarm of wasps on the horizon. At first, he thought it was logging crews working deeper in the pines, but the sound grew louder, heavier, until the ground itself began to tremble. When he stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, his heart froze. A convoy of trucks crawled, Up the dirt road. Two flatbeds carrying bulldozers, another with an excavator, and a white pickup in the lead. Its door marked with the same HOA emblem he'd seen before. Daniel's cabin stood in their path, its weathered logs glowing faintly under the rising sun. But the men who climbed out of those trucks didn't look at it with respect. They looked at it like prey. One by one, hard hats were strapped on, clipboards flipped open, and measuring tapes stretched across the driveway. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take. Daniel stormed toward them, waving his arms, demanding answers. But the foreman didn't even look up. He pointed instead to a folded packet of papers, taped to a wooden stake at the edge of Daniel's property. The word stamped across the top made his stomach drop. Notice of demolition, delinquent property, authorized by court order. His cabin, his father's land, his sanctuary, all reduced to a few sheets of paper with official seals. The men worked fast. Chainsaws buzzed as they cleared brush. Bulldozers groaned as they lurched forward, their steel teeth angled toward the cabin walls. Daniel's protests fell on deaf ears. When he shouted that he'd never joined their HOA, a man in a vest shrugged coldly and muttered, "Talk to the board. We're just following orders. Orders to erase his life." The first blow came from the excavator's arm, slamming into the porch railing he had just repaired. Wood splintered, scattering across the dirt like bones. Daniel's chest tightened. Every swing was a violation, every crash an insult to the years of sweat and memories carved into that place. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the road. Some whispered, horrified at the sight. Others smirked, glad to see that old shack finally being cleared. To them, it was just progress. To Daniel, it was the death of history. By the time the machines clawed through the roof, Daniel could barely breathe. The walls collapsed inward, beams snapping like gunfire. The hearth where his father once sat was buried under a tide of broken logs and dust. His hands shook, fists clenched, but he stood powerless against the swarm of engines. Then came the final insult. When the cabin lay in ruins, one of the workers planted a bright red sign in the dirt. Property foreclosed, maintained. Under HOA jurisdiction, as if they had owned it all along. Daniel collapsed to his knees, staring at the wreckage. The smell of sawdust and gasoline filled the air. What had taken years to build, they had destroyed in less than an hour. But the HOA didn't understand. The line they had crossed, because Daniel was not alone. His family blood ran deep. Brothers, cousins, uncles. And many of them wore badges. Federal badges. The HOA thought they had buried him under rubble. In reality, they had just awakened. A storm. And that storm was already gathering. For days after the demolition, Daniel wandered the wreckage in silence. The cabin was nothing but a scar now. A flattened skeleton of timber, dust, and shattered glass. Each step he took crunched against the remnants of his life. The air still carried the bitter tang of diesel. The sign the HOA had planted stood, tall in the rubble, mocking him with its bold red letters, foreclosed. But Daniel was no ordinary man in the woods. He came from a family that had spent their lives enforcing the law at the highest levels. His father had been a decorated federal marshal. His cousins worked in federal intelligence. His younger brother, Matthew, was a Homeland Security agent. For years, Daniel had lived quietly, deliberately avoiding drawing on those connections. He didn't want to be the man who called in favors or flashed a badge he didn't carry. But when the HOA bulldozed not just his cabin but his family's history, something inside him shifted. This wasn't about unpaid dues. This wasn't about some neighborhood covenant. This was about raw power and the people who thought they could abuse it. So Daniel made a call. By evening, trucks rolled into town. Not construction vehicles this time, but dark SUVs with tinted windows and quiet engines. His family stepped out one by one, their presence heavy, their eyes sharp. These weren't people who came to watch. They came to act. Matthew walked the ruins first, boots crunching against debris, jaw tight as he studied. The destruction. His silence was louder than words. Another cousin took photos, documenting every broken beam, every shattered window, every illegal notice still nailed to Daniel's land. Evidence was piling up with every click of the camera. The HOA had made a grave miscalculation. They believed Daniel was isolated, one man against their machinery. They never imagined he had a network of federal officers in his bloodline, people trained not only to fight corruption, but to dismantle it piece by piece. The first meeting came 2 days later. The HOA board had scheduled a routine gathering at their pristine clubhouse. Polished floors, glass windows, framed certificates lining the walls. It was supposed to be business as usual, budget discussions, landscaping updates, petty complaints about fences and paint colors. But when Daniel walked in flanked by his family, the room fell into silence. The air shifted instantly. Board members stiffened, their smiles faltering as they recognized the quiet authority in the eyes of the people standing behind Daniel. These weren't angry neighbors with pitchforks. These were professionals who could smell lies the way wolves smell blood. One board member cleared his throat, trying to regain composure, insisting everything had been done by the book. But Matthew cut through the words like a blade, laying down photographs of the cabin before and after the demolition, alongside the dubious court order the workers had waived. The seals didn't match federal records, the signatures didn't line up, it was counterfeit, a fake authorization used as a weapon to steal and destroy. Gasps rippled through the room. Some board members shifted uneasily, suddenly realizing the scheme was unraveling. Others doubled down, trying to mask their fear with arrogance, insisting Daniel had brought this upon himself by ignoring HOA obligations. But every excuse only dug the hole deeper. Daniel's family wasn't here to argue about paint colors or late fees. They were here to expose fraud, racketeering, and abuse of power. And with every passing second, the HOA's empire of paperwork and intimidation began to crumble. The board members had thought they were untouchable. Now, under the unflinching gaze of federal eyes, their confidence drained away. What they didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Daniel's family wasn't finished, not even close, because the cabin could never be rebuilt as it was. But justice? Justice could still be carved from the ruins, and the HOA was about to learn what it meant to awaken a family that lived and breathed the law. The board members left that meeting shaken, but not defeated. On the surface, they tried to hold their ground. They told neighbors it was just a misunderstanding, that Daniel's family was overreacting. They doubled down on their narrative: unpaid fees, delinquent notices, foreclosure procedures. To the casual resident, it almost sounded plausible. But the walls were already cracking. Behind the scenes, federal hands had begun moving. The photographs Matthew had taken were sent directly to federal agencies. Counterfeit seals and fraudulent court orders weren't just HOA overreach, they were crimes. Documents that once felt like shields for the HOA now looked like evidence in a trial they couldn't escape. Neighbors began whispering. At first, quietly, then louder. Some remembered how quickly the demolition crew had arrived, like they'd been waiting in the shadows. Others questioned why no official notices had ever been mailed, why everything had felt so rushed, so secretive. And then came the stories. Other homeowners, emboldened by Daniel's defiance, began sharing their own experiences, small fines that had mysteriously tripled overnight, threatening letters for minor violations like leaving a bicycle in the driveway. A family down the street whose shed had been condemned, even though it was newly built and perfectly legal. The HOA had ruled with intimidation for so long, people had accepted it as unshakable law. But now, with federal eyes turned their way, the illusion of power was breaking apart. Daniel, though still grieving his cabin, became a symbol. Every day, more neighbors visited him, offering stories, documents, and sometimes just quiet support. The man who had once been singled out as an outcast was suddenly the rallying point for an entire community. The HOA tried to fight back. They hired lawyers, polished their statements, and sent out newsletters warning residents about the dangers of outsiders interfering in community matters. They painted Daniel as a troublemaker, his family as aggressors. They tried to weaponize fear, the same tactic they had used for years. But fear doesn't work when people no longer believe in it. Because every time the HOA raised its voice, Daniel's family answered with evidence. Every glossy statement from the board was countered with proof of forgery, photographs of intimidation tactics, testimonies from neighbors who had been silenced. The clubhouse, once the board's fortress, began to feel more like a courtroom. And in that courtroom, the board was losing. The breaking point came during a surprise inspection. Federal investigators arrived unannounced one morning, walking past manicured lawns and silent neighbors peeking through curtains. They didn't knock politely. They walked straight into the clubhouse with warrants in hand. Files were seized, computers unplugged, locked drawers forced open. Years of carefully hidden records, fines, fabricated violations, inflated dues were laid bare. Some board members tried to protest, waving their arms and citing community rights. But the investigators didn't flinch. They weren't bound by HOA bylaws. They were bound by federal law, and what they found looked less like community management and more like organized theft. That night, the neighborhood was restless. People gathered in small groups, whispering about what they had seen. The board members who once strutted down the street with authority now avoided eye contact. Their empire of control, built on paper fines, fear, and silence, was collapsing under the weight of real accountability. And Daniel? For the first time since the demolition, he felt a shift inside him. The cabin was gone forever, but the battle had become something larger. This wasn't about wood and stone anymore. It was about exposing what happens when unchecked power festers, in the places people should feel safest, their own homes. But he also knew one thing with certainty. Desperate people don't surrender quietly. The HOA had been cornered, and cornered powers often strike back with teeth. And in the shadows of that quiet suburban street, the board was already plotting its final move. The HOA's empire had crumbled, but not completely. Pride is a powerful thing, and the board refused to vanish without one last attempt to claw back control. It happened on a cold evening, weeks after the federal raid. Notices were slipped under every homeowner's door. The board was calling for an emergency meeting, the kind of gathering where they had once held all the power, where neighbors had sat in quiet rows while they dictated rules and fines. But this time, it was different. The community showed up in force, not out of fear but defiance. Families filled the clubhouse, their eyes sharp, their voices low with anticipation. Daniel stood quietly in the back, not as a victim, but as a witness to the change he had helped ignite. His brothers, the federal agents, flanked him. Their presence was subtle, but undeniable, the kind of silent authority that could not be faked. The board members walked in late, carrying binders and stacks of papers as if they still controlled the room. They tried to speak with the same booming authority as before, reciting bylaws, threatening legal action, insisting the federal investigation was a misunderstanding, but no one listened. One by one, neighbors began standing up. They demanded answers. They presented their own evidence. They asked questions the board could no longer dodge. And as the voices rose, the board's authority dissolved. It was not a trial, but it felt like one. Every accusation was met with silence. Every denial was drowned out by facts. And then, in a moment no one expected, one of the board members broke. The treasurer, once the keeper of the books, stood up, trembling, and admitted what everyone already suspected. The fines had been inflated. The foreclosure threats had been manufactured. The money had been siphoned. The room erupted, gasps, shouts, whispers, all crashing into each other like a storm. For years, the board had hidden behind a mask of legitimacy, but now, with the truth spoken aloud, that mask shattered. Federal C. Agents who had been watching from the back stepped forward. The treasurer's confession was more than enough. One by one, board members were escorted out of the clubhouse under the weight of real authority, not the hollow kind they had wielded for years. The neighborhood that had lived in fear suddenly felt free. Neighbors hugged, some wept, others simply stood in stunned silence, as if waiting to wake from a nightmare that had lasted far too long. And at the center of it all was Daniel. The cabin was still gone. The land where it had stood was bare, scarred by what the HOA had destroyed. But as he looked around the clubhouse, Daniel understood something deeper. The fight had never really been about four walls and a roof. It had been about the principle that no one, no matter how small their empire, should have the power to strip away someone's home, dignity, and freedom. In time, lawsuits followed. The board members faced charges. Restitution funds were set aside for families who had been wronged. The HOA itself was dissolved, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association with limited power and true transparency. But the most powerful outcome wasn't legal. It was human. The community changed. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now shared meals, offered help, and looked out for one another. Fear no longer hung over their streets. Instead, there was resilience, born from the ashes of one cabin and the courage of one man who refused to be broken. Daniel never rebuilt the cabin. He left the land as it was, with a simple bench placed where the front porch had once been. Sometimes he sat there in silence, listening to the wind, watching the light shift through the trees that still stood. It wasn't a home anymore, but it was something greater, a reminder that power can be challenged, that fear can be broken, and that even the strongest walls of control eventually collapse. And for anyone who passed by, that bench stood as a quiet monument to a truth the HOA had never understood. A house can be torn down, but a community awakened is indestructible.